Hi, everyone. We are so excited to have you here today. My name is Angela Staunton. I am a CTE coordinator alongside my pal here.
Perva called us partners in crime today, just like
Oh,
you didn't know
nice,
that. I
nice.
know, I liked it too. Hi, my name's Gretchen Reyes. I'm also your CTE coordinator, and we just are so thrilled to introduce to you and have Almaz on with us today to talk to us about what she focuses on. Just to give a little background, she's an assistant professor of instruction in psychology and a college advisor at Northwestern University. She researches and examines how insights from cognitive psychology can inform our pedagogical practices and vice versa. She is particularly interested in understanding how anxiety can promote or hinder one's capacity to perform. When Angela and I were working on what we wanted to present to the faculty this fall, really focusing on, how we are in the classroom with our students and understanding that level of anxiety that our students, have, we are in the age of COVID, but I think even before COVID, our students had that. So we're just so thankful, Almaz, to be here, and we can't wait to hear your presentation. So thank you.
Thank you. And just very quickly, just so everyone knows, we will have Almaz will do an hour presentation. We've disabled the chat box, and then after she's done from 3 to 3:30, we can open up for questions in the chat, or just raise your hand and and she'll answer your questions that way. So thank you so much.
Thank you both. Thank you for organizing this and inviting me to speak at the CTE at Triton. I'm really excited to be, like I said earlier, sharing this with more than just my own academic circles. I've been really intending for my research to be put in front of practitioners and put in front of instructors and people who are interested in supporting students from like a teacher perspective, a student support perspective, res ed, anything. So again, thanks for inviting me. Like you guys said in your introduction, a lot of this applies both pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. So kind of something I'll be bringing up a lot during this talk is that like I use the pandemic as kind of a source of data to exemplify the ways that anxiety can influence college students' performance and learning, but this is definitely something that has existed before, and the same mechanisms apply in explaining students' learning and performance now and in the future, and maybe even are compounded by COVID. I'll talk about that, but anyways, I just wanted to say thank you again for inviting me, and I can get started. So I believe actually this talk will probably be just under an hour, so we might have a little bit more time for Q&A. Okay, so just a slight different kind of version of an introduction. I really wanted to explain like how I got to my position I'm at Northwestern, and kind of where I fitted into the research. A lot of researchers call their work me-search, like it's this idea that like we're studying a lot of the things that maybe impacted us in our prior experiences or maybe in the future or currently. But my name is Almaz Miskina. I just recently finished my PhD in May of this year at the University of Chicago, and then I just took up this position at Northwestern. And my work is really like we got in this introduction, my work is really interested in bridging the gap between research and practice, right? So really bridging the gap between the science of learning and what we know as researchers that's important for promoting students' learning and pedagogy, what we actually do in the classroom. I'm really, really interested in closing this gap and making sure that what we're doing as researchers and scientists is actually put to use. And it kind of corresponds with a lot of the roles that I have held and that I currently hold. So the then was very recent, like earlier this year, right? So like I said, I just got my PhD at the University of Chicago. I really studied anxiety and stress, kind of like negative emotional experiences generally, what they do in the brain, and then how that actually impacts learning. I studied this with fifth graders, and I studied this with undergraduates, kind of focusing on STEM, mathematics and science learning specifically. I did a lot of teaching in my graduate program. I was a teaching consultant, which I was working with our Center for Teaching very closely at the University of Chicago, so I was really interested in going into my peers' my peers' classes, and making sure that their instruction was inclusive of all students, that they were using assessment techniques that actually assess student learning, and that they were designing their classroom in a way that supported student learning. And then very recently, I had an internship with Northwestern ASLA. I won't go into too much detail, but essentially they try to take cognitive insights and try to scaffold peer-to-peer learning so that students have kind of low stakes learning opportunities with their peers to support their learning in difficult classes like chem, bio, that kind of thing. So that actually brought me to my current position. Right now I'm, like they said, assistant professor of instruction in psychology at Northwestern. And so I'm essentially on the teaching track, and I'm going to be teaching 1 to 2 classes a year in psychology. But really what's important with my job is I combine this with an academic advisor position. And so I have like a joint appointment. And so being an academic advisor at Northwestern means that I get a cohort of first-year students, and I basically provide them academic, personal, emotional resources and support for their whole 4 years. So if we're thinking about the development of a student as they go through community college, university, whatever, it's good to have a supportive person, somebody in their corner. And so I think as we go through this talk, a running theme is going to be this supporting students, whether they're in distress or whether they're not, right? Combined with the teaching practices and the insights that we bring from research. And so I just wanted, I don't want to talk about myself too much, but just kind of painting the scene in this focus on thinking about the whole student. And that requires a research perspective, a teaching perspective, and a support perspective. That's enough about me. Okay, so I'm going to give a brief outline for what I'm going to be discussing in this talk, and then we'll jump right into it. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about kind of anxiety in undergraduates, college students more generally in the United States. And like I said, I'm going to use insights from a recent study that I completed about the COVID-19 pandemic and how anxiety influenced students' learning. But again, the implications are more generalizable to anxiety in general. And then second, thinking about the science of anxiety. So if we know people are really anxious, how does anxiety seep into the brain? How does it disrupt our cognitive processes necessary for learning? And then given what we know about the cognitive mechanisms that explain anxiety learning relationships, what kind of interventions can we use to kind of, capture students' attention, maintain students' attention for classwork, and then help them promote their learning? There's 2 types of interventions I'm going to discuss. The first are pedagogical strategies, so things that we can embed into our own teaching. And then the second are more student-focused, so managing emotions, teaching students emotion regulation strategies. And I have data to support the latter, and then more evidence from research in general, and my experience as a teaching consultant for the former. And then tangible takeaways for us, as I know this is an audience that's primarily instructors or faculty at the college, but I think anybody who works with students, I will summarize with some main takeaways for us all. Okay, so again, starting with anxiety and thinking about this in undergraduate and college student samples, and looking at the pandemic specifically. So I think it's no surprise that anxiety has been kind of a huge issue in undergraduate spaces and on college campuses in general. So this is data that actually came out, and this was collected in 2019, so right before the onset of the pandemic. And so a quarter of students that were surveyed, this is undergraduate community college students, all students enrolled in a college program, about a quarter of them had a diagnosed anxiety disorder. And if we think about diagnoses, we know that a lot of students probably have undiagnosed anxiety disorder. And importantly, of those that were surveyed, this was a national survey, tens of thousands of students. Of those are, even those that don't have a diagnosed anxiety disorder, 50% of students say that they do believe that anxiety actually negatively impacts their academic performance to some degree. And then there's actually some recent data that looked at this, kind of separating out community college students versus 4-year institutions. And I pulled this specifically for the talk here with Triton. And what we see is that the rate of diagnosed anxiety disorder is 1.25 times that of the 4-year university rate. So community college students are experiencing anxiety disorder to a higher degree than students at 4-year institutions. They actually also experience the negative impact on their performance to the same degree. And yet, unfortunately, community college students are less likely to acquire the resources that are necessary to help them protect them against anxiety. Things like therapy, medication, resources that they might have both on campus and off campus. And the research also shows it's more likely due to experienced financial obstacles that students in community colleges are experiencing. So I just wanted to point this out, that a lot of the data I'm showing is like undergraduates, looking at students from like University of Chicago and the University of California system. And I know that these are, qualitatively different student bodies, student programs, but I just want to keep in mind that what we're discussing might be exacerbated or greater in community college samples. And in the Q&A, I would love to hear your experiences and your kind of insights from talking to your own students. And that's all, again, data that was collected in 2019. So that was pre-pandemic, right? And, one thing that we want to think about is, what is this going to look like in the future? What is it going to look like now, given that, we have students in hybrid classes? We're trying to come to this new normal, but it's not necessarily normal yet. So I think what I'm really interested in knowing, and a lot of practitioners and researchers are kind of investigating this as well, is what kind of challenges that transition back to in-person is going to bring. So we have general anxiety that's been on the rise already in college student samples. And then now we have the pandemic on top of it, which I'll show you guys has also exacerbated anxiety. And so what is going to happen in the future when students are kind of bringing multiple sources of anxiety to the classroom, right? And another important thing to think about here is that I don't know what this is like on your campus, but I think some campuses, mine included, have a little bit of a selective amnesia. So kind of forgetting that the past 18 months have been quite traumatic and trying to usher in a new normal when in fact we have anxiety from multiple sources and unresolved issues that are still ongoing. Like people with children who are unvaccinated, I was talking to my colleagues about this, still feel that their kids, health is a concern for them and something that other people who maybe have completely vaccinated families might not have to deal with. So there's a lot of different sources that might compound anxiety that's already been on the rise in colleges. So I'm going to share a little bit of an overview of the study that we did with undergraduates during the pandemic last year and a little bit of the beginning of this year. I'm going to provide an overview of the study and then kind of go through the results and kind of scaffold our way through the results as I go through this talk. But I'll just provide all of the information here. So we actually ran this study in the University of California system. So I have some colleagues that are at the University of California, and you're going to see this timeline for our data collection. We had one wave of data collection towards the beginning of the pandemic in late spring, and then a second wave of data collection the first fall of the pandemic. I have kind of like some of the main time points that were pertaining to each wave, CA standing for California. So anyways, across both waves, we had about 640 undergraduates who participated in our study. 74% of them were women, which is kind of consistent with volunteer samples we get. The race ethnicity of the participants that we had in this study also largely resembled the University of California schools we went to. We were at Irvine and Riverside, so predominantly Asian American, Latinx, and about half of the students were first gen. So I'm going to describe again the study procedure here and just provide an overview, and then we'll talk about more of the specifics as they become relevant throughout the talk. So this was a study that we did kind of remotely. So we gave students Qualtrics surveys, and we were just asking about their experiences during the pandemic. And then we also gave them a lesson to assess their learning. But I'll go through each of them kind of in detail. So the first thing we did during the study was we assessed students' perceptions of the pandemic, right? So the anxiety that they were experiencing during the pandemic, and then also the specific worries they had pertaining to the pandemic. I'll describe those in detail shortly. And then after that, we gave them emotion regulation interventions. So these are instructions to help students regulate their emotions prior to the lesson. These are research-based strategies that I'll talk about later on in the talk. And then after we gave them some time to practice these emotion regulation strategies, we then gave them an assessment of learning. So we gave them a pretty detailed neuroscience lesson. We assessed their mind wandering, and then we tested them on what they learned. So again, these will be talked about later in detail as they pertain to the later parts of the talk, but I'm going to focus here on the COVID-19 perceptions first. So the first thing we did is we measured their anxiety about COVID, and then we used this impact of event scale. This is kind of like a global measure of how much the pandemic has just kind of impacted students in general. So kind of a general sense of how anxious they are, how disruptive the pandemic has been. Here's one example item. And then we also assessed students' specific worries about the pandemic. So this is based on research and also just our kind of like probing students about the things that were most stressful for them. And so these are technological obstacles to the pandemic or to their learning, social obstacles to their learning, distractions they're experiencing, and then worries about their health and others' health, economic impact of the pandemic, and then worries about obtaining social support they need. So I'll detail these here in a second. So the first thing I wanted to do was kind of show you the distribution of COVID-19 anxiety. So this is all 641 students across both wave 1, which was spring, and wave 2, which was fall of 2020. It was kind of on the higher end. This doesn't really make sense, so I thought I would just kind of break this up for you to kind of get a better explanation of what this means qualitatively. So the scale could actually be divided into basically low, moderate, and severe anxiety. And so we have about 52% of the students who were sampled who were low to mild anxiety. This is essentially manageable, like little to no impact of COVID on their anxiety and well-being. Half of them felt that. 37% of students had a moderate anxiety level with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is actually where, based on the scale that we used, treatment is recommended. And then 11% of students, 1 in 10, had reported severe anxiety in response to COVID-19 pandemic. And this number did not change whether it was right when it started in spring or in fall and winter after we had experienced it for a few months. And then importantly, we see that women more so than men had reported moderate to severe anxiety with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. So the next thing we were worried about is like, okay, students are feeling really anxious about it. So what specifically are they worrying about? And then also to what extent are they worrying about this? So these were the kind of categories of worries that we had probed students on, again, based on what past literature was seeing, but then also based on what we were seeing as, at the time, grad students, but then also as instructors and also people who were working with student research lab. So again, we have tech obstacles. So like, do I have access to internet or computer? Social obstacles, which is like, can I contact my professor if I really need something for them? Do I have access to study groups? Distractions in the learning environment, like, you know, being in a noisy house with other people trying to learn, or just maybe even the general distraction of having your phone on you. Health concerns, the economic impact, I think we know what those are, and then finding social support. So students were oftentimes worried about being able to find and access the resources that they need in order to perseverate and do well despite stressful situations. A lot of these are on-campus resources too, so going virtual can exacerbate that. But anyways, these were the 6 categories. So for each one, we asked students, oh, and here we go. So worries about COVID impacting school achievement, and then worries that apply to all adults, not just those in school, right? And so these numbers are the percentage of all the students that said yes to worrying about each of the category. So you can see that at least 50% of students said yes to each of these worries. And then basically what we wanted to do now is, okay, like you could say yes to being worried about tech obstacles, but not really, right? So the next thing we wanted to do was to see how worried students were. So on a scale of 0, not worried, to 100, very worried. And the main takeaway here is that on average, students, if they were worried about something, they were quite worried about it. And what's really important here is distractions. And this is going to be a recurring theme in this talk, is the influence of distractions on performance. And so we see 58% of students said yes, that they were worried about distractions in the learning environment. And we see that this is something that women, first-gen students, and Latinx students had reported experiencing far more than their peers. And actually, first-gen Latinx women were the sample within our study that was most impacted by anxiety, by these worries, but interestingly not their learning. We could talk about that later in the Q&A. But this intersectionality is really important to consider. The students who have historically marginalized identities and who were kind of relied on during the pandemic in their homes were also experiencing a lot of worries around distractions. Here are some quotes just quickly I'm going to share from students, because we also asked them to elaborate on what they were feeling. So again, some of the quotes about distractions. During exams, they find it difficult to get a quiet environment where they're uninterrupted. Having many responsibilities at home make it difficult to focus on schoolwork. Connecting with professors and students, it might be embarrassing because on Zoom we have people in the background. And also just the general distractions, like I said, about phones and social media. Social media also being a place where you could get information about the pandemic too. Okay, so that was a little bit about kind of the state of anxiety, not necessarily general anxiety, but anxiety specifically about the pandemic that students were experiencing throughout 2020 and into 2021. And again, we did measure trait anxiety, and it was elevated. So trait anxiety being just the general sense of anxiety that students carry with them all the time. It was elevated during the pandemic relative to a lot of normative data. I didn't report that there, but I think what I really want us to think about is that anxiety is elevated. Students are compounding this anxiety with anxiety they're bringing in from the pandemic. And as we're thinking about the future, the pandemic is ongoing. You know, I know you guys are in a bit of a mix of a hybrid form of learning, in-person, hybrid, and remote. And a lot of these worries and distractions and stuff still very much play a role here. So anyways, we've got the anxiety part out of the way. Now let's think about the science of anxiety. So if we know people are anxious, how does it manifest cognitively? So what does anxiety and worries actually do to the brain that in turn harms our learning? So what does it mean to feel anxious, right? So anxiety is really, it's a prolonged response to a real, a perceived, or imagined threat. And anxiety, the experience of anxiety really thrives in uncertainty. So oftentimes people compare anxiety or even conflate anxiety and fear, right? Anxiety can have a lot of the same physical manifestations that fear does. So when we're feeling anxious, our sympathetic nervous system is activated, right? Our heart is beating, our hands are sweaty. But the important thing about anxiety is the cognitive response and how it differs from fear, right? And so there's two aspects of the cognitive response that I really want to focus on. So the first is that anxiety generates a lot of worries. That's something that we had measured when I showed you the data in the first part. But worries are these increases in ruminations that are verbally rehearsed. So you can imagine the like mental churn of like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, or like, what if this happens, or what if this happens? So that anxiety really generates worry, whereas fear is a little bit faster. There's not time to deliberate on fear. You either see something you're afraid of or you're not. Anxiety lets us really ruminate in a way that is ultimately quite harmful. And the other cognitive aspect to anxiety is attentional capture. So it's our hyper focus on threats and worries, because if we're feeling anxious about something, it's in our best interest to pay a lot of attention to the thing that's worrying us. Another way to think about attentional capture and this kind of bias towards threat is just distraction. So if we're trying to focus on something and we're really worried about something and we're putting our attention towards there, ultimately we're distracted. So it's this worry and attentional capture that we're going to be focusing on in this section. So I'm going to exemplify what this might look like. And I'm going to have you guys indulge me and pretend you're in my intro stats class. So imagine you have a word problem here, right? You got to solve for the confidence interval, right? And calculate a confidence interval. You know, if you're going to calculate a confidence interval, you're going to have to go through all the necessary steps. You're going to have to evaluate what data you have, read the problem, pull the relevant information. You're going to need to reflect on what formulas are necessary, fit the data into the formula, solve the formula, right? And then you have an answer, and you're going to have to interpret the answer back in the context of the word problem that you got. Not to mention you have to deal with all the jargon, the Latin, you know, symbols, all the stuff. That's you know, it's a lot. It's a lot to solve math. It's a lot to do word problems. It's quite taxing cognitively to do all that. But you know, the thing that we're knowing, and the thing that we all know as instructors or people who support students, is that people are often juggling more than just the work they have to do whenever they're solving a problem, right? So students are also juggling a lot of the anxieties, and specifically what's popping up is the worries that a student might have. These are specifically about COVID, but other worries about like making sure you do well, ruminating about consequences of poor performance, and as these red quotes are showing, these are real quotes that students shared in our study about the impact of the pandemic. And so what's happening is you have students who are juggling the steps that they need to do, right? Complex steps to solve a problem. And then they're also simultaneously juggling and thinking about and ruminating on real world, you know, worries that must be attended to. So ideally, if we had, you know, brains, maybe in a couple million years of evolution, we could separate the math side of our brain and the worry side of our brain. But you know, in reality, that's not the case. Actually, what happens is that our worries, right, we are so hyper-focused on them, it tends to disrupt the thinking and the cognitive processes that we need in order to solve anything, to do any kind of like math, any kind of learning, any kind of higher order thinking and reasoning. And so, you know, our worries are really interrupting this focus that we need in order to perform. And this, in fact, can threaten our performance, as we'll see. And so, you know, one of the key cognitive processes, actually the key cognitive process that kind of underlies a lot of the anxiety-related impairments in performance is working memory. I'm not too sure how familiar you all are with working memory. Working memory can be thought of as short-term memory plus manipulation. So it's not just holding things in mind in the short term, but it's actively manipulating things in the service of solving something or reasoning through something. So you can imagine it's not just holding a formula in mind, right? But it's looking at the problem, figuring out what data you need, putting that data in your brain, manipulating it, kind of interpreting things like that. So working memory is just crucial for academic performance for that reason. A lot of what we're doing in academic performance and problem solving is holding things in mind and manipulating it and thinking about it. It's critical for academic achievement. There it is. But the thing about working memory is it is extremely limited. It is a very limited cognitive resource. So there's only so much that we can hold in mind and manipulate at the same time. So what that means is that whenever we have a worry pop up and we think about it and we're hyper-focused on it, it takes up cognitive space that we need in order to learn and perform and reason. So kind of to sum it all up really quickly, when we experience greater anxiety, it increases the worries, the thoughts that we're ruminating on, that we're attending to. It increases our attentional capture to those things, right? In other words, it decreases our attention towards the math or whatever we need to learn. And what happens then is it consumes our working memory, right? Our limited working memory resources are replaced instead with these worries, and then we have reduced performance, and as I'll show later, reduced learning too. Worry harms learning too, right? And so I'm not too sure if you guys are familiar with the cognitive load theory. I'm going to kind of go through this quickly. We don't need to spend too much detail on it. But you know, there's kind of multiple aspects of cognitive load that are required for learning. So the first is intrinsic working memory load. So we can think about it as how complex is the thing that we have to learn. Is it a bunch of formula that we have to memorize, or is it just something very simple that we have to learn? So how complex is something that we have to learn? And then the germane working memory load is basically the working memory that we need to dedicate to acquiring new knowledge, organizing new knowledge, processing new knowledge. So these are the types of working memory loads that we have when we're learning. And then there's another type called extraneous working memory load. And this is anything beyond the things that we need to learn that actually burdens our working memory and takes up working memory space. One of the things that burdens our working memory is extraneous is the worries, right? So if we have worries that we're attending to while we're learning, then it's hard for us to dedicate working memory to the inherent complexity of the learning content. And it's hard for us to dedicate our working memory resources to acquiring and processing this new knowledge when we have these extraneous, right? Extraneous to the thing we need to learn, worries that are taking up our cognitive space. So I'm really interested in the learning piece specifically. How does worry and anxiety impact our learning? So that's what this part of this study is, right? This latter half. And so I'll describe these bits in detail here. So the first thing is, if you'll remember, we assessed their anxiety and worries. I'll talk about the emotion regulation later, but then later on we assessed their learning. So we gave them a neuroscience lesson. It was a 15-minute lesson. It was designed to be the same length that research is suggesting is the best length, like to chunk, our lectures. So it's a 15-minute lecture, extremely detailed about like song learning and birds. We chose a very detailed neuroscience lesson, but we wanted to ask questions that were quite generalizable. So we were hoping students would do a little bit of higher order thinking and take details and apply it to human learning in general. So they watched this lesson, and then they got a mind wandering survey. So mind wandering can be considered a behavioral manifestation of distraction, right? If we let our mind wander onto things that are of personal salience, then we know that students are not attending. So we use this to assess whether they were distracted. And then we gave them the test afterwards, tested on what they remembered from the neuroscience lesson. So there were 3 items that just kind of asked students to recall what they remembered. These were all multiple choice. And then they had 3 items that assessed their higher order reasoning. So again, taking the details they learned here and trying to make generalizations about human learning in general. I'm just going to sum up the results really quickly. It was very clear across the first wave and the second wave of data collection that anxiety harms learning by increasing their mind wandering. So basically, students who had higher anxiety about the pandemic had lower learning, but then there's an indirect effect that was far more interesting. So basically, students who were higher in COVID anxiety also mind wandered a lot more. They reported that they mind wandered a lot more during the lesson. They were quite honest with us. And then those who were mind wandering more during the lesson also had reduced learning. They had a lower score on the test. And it's the indirect effect here that's really interesting. So this mediation suggests that the reason that anxiety led to lower learning is because it had increased students' mind wandering. And what's really important here is we controlled for trait anxiety levels, which means that this was specifically a COVID thing. Although one of the next steps I have in redoing this analysis is to think about whether there's an interactive effect between the COVID anxiety and the trait anxiety that they have. Because it might be the case that COVID is additive, right, or exacerbates the trait anxiety they had. So the next question is, what about real life learning? Like we gave them a fake lesson, right? A neuroscience lesson that didn't really have any personal stake for them. And we're going to talk about emotion regulation later and why I think the personal stakes of the learning environment really matters. But this is something I pose to you all. I think we're slowly starting to see more research come out that shows exactly that empirical data that tells us that the pandemic is actually harming students' grades, and there's a lot of correlation. We're really interested here. What I'm really interested in is cognitively, what is explaining this? And I think attention is something that we should be really careful in thinking about. Okay. So given that we know that working memory is a really important cognitive resource in understanding anxiety, performance, anxiety, learning relations, and given that we know that worry can, the worry that we have when we're anxious can take up that working memory space and distract us. Let's think about attentional capture interventions, right? So in what ways can we kind of mitigate the effects of worry to distraction to impaired learning? So there's like 2 levels of intentional capture interventions. So again, the pedagogical strategies, which is the first one I talk about, and then we can talk about more student-focused emotion regulation interventions. Pedagogical strategies are within all of our, we have agency to make changes in our classroom, and that's kind of a very empowering thing to think about when everything else about the pandemic seems like it's out of our control. So here's my little crude brain drawing again. So if you'll remember, right, when we think about the working memory that we need to devote in order to learning, we have these parts are really related to actually learning the material. Extraneous working memory load, again, is anything that beyond the learning content that burdens our working memory. So that includes the worries that I talked about, but there's other things in our teaching that might actually burden students cognitively and take away those resources they need to learn. And that's things like using jargon whenever we're presenting, using symbols. Like think about my statistics example. A lot of symbols, a lot of Latin words, stuff like that. And then also the way that we present our instruction and we design our instruction, it might actually place a burden on working memory. And if you have a burden on your working memory on top of the worries that you're having, right, you can imagine that extraneous load is going to be bigger. It's going to take up more of your working memory space, of your limited working memory space. And so one of the goals in this section is thinking about how we can minimize the extraneous load to maximize the amount of working memory space that students can put forward for learning and for learning complex things, because I think our expectations of students going into, you know, the future is we want them to get back to the place where they're able to engage in higher order thinking and reasoning. And so how do we remove jargon, remove symbols, reshape our instructional design in such a way that we can kind of lower this extraneous burden? So that's what we're going to be talking about in this section. And I'm going to be focusing kind of on this section on instructional design. So ways that we can organize our instruction to facilitate students' learning and students' higher order reasoning and learning. And then the second part of attentional capture interventions is how do we help students reduce their worries? So this is kind of my take at an analogy to kind of explain this. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with mise en place. I think it's French for everything in its place. And it's a way in which people prepare, you know, chefs, very fancy chefs, kind of prepare and organize their cooking so that they can cook more effectively and more creatively. So with mise en place, this is an example I found on Pinterest, but essentially you do all of the dicing, all of the chopping, all of the peeling, everything, all of the prep work for your cooking, right? And you have it all laid out and organized and measured so that whenever it's time for you to cook, right, there's no chaos and I got to chop the potatoes and I got to saute the onions at the same time. Well, I got to measure this and I got to shred the chicken. If you have everything organized and laid out first, it makes the process of cooking less chaotic, more fun, and provides space for you to be more creative, right? If you're busy trying to juggle all of the measurement and all of the slicing and everything, you can't think, oh, maybe I'll add a little bit more I don't know, maybe I'll add a little bit more garlic today, or let me try ginger in this recipe. There's no room for creative or elaborative thinking when you're so muddled in the details. And so this is the analogy I want us to think about with our instruction. How do we, right, because the goal in cooking is not to see how effectively one chops onions. The goal with cooking is to see how good the final product is. How creative were you in getting this product? How efficient were you in getting to the final product? And that's the same with learning. We don't care about how quickly students can dice the onions or how good students are at juggling certain things. We care about the final product. Do they actually learn and demonstrate their learning in a flexible, interesting, creative way? So a lot of the examples I'm going to show are going to be examples of how we can organize our instruction to help students get to the ultimate higher order thing, and so they don't get bogged down in the, you know, the dicing onion, so to speak. So like I said, doing this reduces chaotic multitasking. When you're doing this kind of cooking, it fosters greater enjoyment. You're more efficient, even under pressure. You can be creative, you can experiment, you can really get into the weeds here. Okay. So yes, like I said, a fundamental question is how do we mise en place our lessons? How do we organize our lessons in a way that students can more efficiently get to the main idea? I will show some screenshots and examples that I think illustrates this and maybe makes the analogy a little bit more clear. I'm going to use an example from my statistics class. So with statistics, you know, there's a couple ways you can learn statistics. I think the most common way and the least taxing way for students is that they want to just memorize all the formulas or just memorize, like, what does this number mean? Great, I'm going to answer it on a test and then I'm going to forget it, right? But one of the ultimate learning goals for statistics is for students to see patterns across formula, patterns across different protocols in statistics in order for them to get main ideas about what we're actually trying to do here. And so one of the things we see in statistics pedagogy and statistics research, I'm happy to share this later. I have other research that shows that just students, like, they can get an A in stats, they can get they know how to employ formula, but they do not at all understand what is going on. They don't understand it conceptually. One of the things we want to do is to show students, like, hey, you can run an ANOVA, hey, you can run a regression, and they're actually doing the same thing. But if you present these two things to students, there's, first of all, a lot for them to deal with. There's a lot of symbols. It's hard for them to make the connections between relevant things, right? We can see that maybe gender is in both of these models, but they're structured differently. We have fundamentally different numbers. And if I'm trying to show students how are these the same, it's really hard for them to clearly understand this, right? So how can we mise en place this, right? How can we reorganize this so that they can see the comparisons more clearly? And so me and my co-instructor at the time designed this kind of like activity, this table, to help students go from this, what the heck is going on, to this, to make the comparisons really clear, because the fundamental learning objective for us is not for them to understand this number is the same as this number, but why? What does it mean, right? And so that's what we did. We had, a column for one ANOVA, a column for multiple regression, a column for students to tell us whether it's the same or different, and this, right? This is what we really want students to know, is the why. So if we mise en place all of this, if we set all of these columns up for students and scaffold their learning for them, right? Put the number here, put the number here, put the number here, put the number here. They can spend more time doing this, which is what we ultimately care about and what we ultimately want them to feel creative and experiment with and try while we're with them in the classroom. It doesn't have to be just STEM. A lot of the stuff I've been talking about is STEM, but this can apply to the humanities too. This is I apologize if it's blurry. This is a picture I took from when I was a teaching consultant last year. Essentially, this was a humanities class. The professor really wanted to get students' understanding of culture, like what the student thought about culture, what the authors that they were reading about thought about culture, and then the main objective, the professor told me later, is why certain historical, personal, whatever, contextual influences shape our understanding of culture. I believe that's what they were going for. But if you look at the screen right now, what are we going for here, right? You can imagine if a student got up from Zoom, went to the bathroom and came back, or even if a student in class, right, even pre-pandemic, went to the bathroom and came back, how could I look at this and get a sense of what is to be learned here, what the main idea is? So we talked about it, and again, one way to organize the whiteboard in order to get to the main idea, right? Why? This is the thing that we care about as instructors. So basically, we had the instructor think about organizing the authors, yourself, how you would define culture, and then ultimately the why. And then whenever you do it in this way, it's more clear. You're going to get whatever the instructor was going for, historical, cultural influences that explain why each explanation of culture differs. Again, so we're just, STEM, humanities, whatever, thinking about how we use our learning technologies. Yes, the whiteboard is a learning technology, to scaffold learning so that, students aren't bogged down. Like, you don't want students to devote their working memory to searching through this, trying to figure out what the commonalities are. Let's scaffold it for them, right? And so in this way, we can be mindful about their working memory. And on top of the fact that students might be distracted by other things, let's make it as simple as possible. We're not giving them the answer here, right? We're leaving this open for them, but just scaffolding it. Why is that blank? Oh, I see. So another way to do it is to think about the technologies. I said whiteboard is a technology. It's an old one. How about new technologies like Google Jamboard and other things? So I'm giving you this example to show how we can mise en place even within the technologies that we've been afforded with remote learning. So I'm very interested in emotion regulation. So during the time around the election, I had polled my peers in my lab, and we were just kind of asking how you're coping with the election, right? Google Jamboard is really great. You can just pick sticky notes and then type what you're feeling and move them around, and you can react to other people's sticky notes. It's great. It's interactive. I highly recommend it for those of you who are still teaching online. But what can you make of this, right? Everybody kind of picked the same blue thing. They scattered it everywhere. It's really hard to kind of get at a so what, or like what are people really how are people dealing with the election? So this takes a little bit of planning, but again, with these tools, we can actually organize things in a way that makes them conducive to learning and learning more efficiently, right? And so it doesn't matter what these are. These are just different types of emotion regulation. I was trying to teach my lab some of the stuff on emotion regulation that I had learned. And so you can organize things physically, you can change the color, you can label categories. And here I can get a bigger picture, right? Instead of saying, how are people coping with the election? You can actually say, well, actually, a lot of people are falling in this category. And now, instead of the search as the primary means in which we're spending our instructional time, it's the why, it's the what can we draw from this that we're doing here. This takes a little bit of planning, obviously. I'm sure there's other more creative ways to use Google Jamboard and other online instructional tools, but the point being here is that we have a lot of tools at our disposal in order to, organize our instruction so that we reduce that extraneous burden, and so students can get to the meat and potatoes. No pun intended with our mise en place example, but the meat and potatoes of what we want students to actually get from our class. Okay, I decided to leave this slide in here because I know a lot of you guys are still teaching on Zoom or Blackboard or whatever kind of online platform. There's a lot on Zoom fatigue. I mean, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. We've all been on our computers for so long now. We know Zoom communication is really unnatural and taxing. I've been speaking to my green light on my MacBook this whole time, just assuming that you guys have been paying attention. But we know that it's just, I over accentuate and gesture in order to make sure that my communication is being clear in my two-dimensional form to you guys without much feedback. It's taxing. We don't have nonverbal cues, so we're focusing a lot on words and eye contact when we're in gallery view. We have lags, and I hope I don't have lags in this talk, but we have lags that actually kind of stilt our communication as well. Again, preaching to the choir. One thing I really want to focus on is concerns about the self, which is actually quite common. So this comes with having our computer on, or our camera on. So if you have your camera on, right, then you might be worried about, like, does my apartment look messy? Do I look like that? We were talking about having spinach in our teeth earlier today, post lunch. So having your image shared back to you is extremely unnatural and actually can place additional working memory burden that I want to talk about. And this is a perspective we haven't really thought much about with thinking about Zoom and instruction. A recent survey, actually, this came from Cornell, I think. They were just assessing their students and asking, hey, like, you're in intro bio, why is your camera off? 2 and 5 students said that it was because they were worried about their appearance, that they thought they were looking rough and they didn't necessarily want to be on camera. A quarter of students said it was concerned about surroundings. And so, oftentimes we think that we want to be mindful of students' bandwidth and make for their camera and their internet, and make sure their camera's turned off, which was a good chunk of students. But for many students, it's really taxing to just look at yourself the whole day, and it's really distracting too. There's a lot of information and applications and stuff for people to look good on Zoom, which kind of speaks to this. We're constantly thinking about our self-presentation on top of trying to focus during the lecture. So something to keep in mind. The other thing is that, like, for some students, it's actually, in their treatment for, eating disorder or their own anxiety, they don't look at mirrors, they don't look at themselves, and this could actually exacerbate challenges that they're facing in their personal life. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I don't think it's something that we think about a lot with having cameras on or off, but in fact it ties into this working memory piece that I'm sharing. One reason is that we are just so attuned as humans to the face, to our self-presentation. It's really, really difficult to disengage from your face once you've seen it. There's a lot of interesting psychology work that shows that. So you can imagine then if your face is here in the corner of Zoom or Blackboard or whatever, you turn to it a lot. And I'm sure you guys experience this as well. One thing, again, is to make having the camera on optional when you're engaging in deep learning. So if you're having students do something really deep and having them really reflect or think in their class, you should encourage the camera to be off. And later on, I'm going to actually share some students' opinions themselves who they also recommend this. This actually is an old screenshot, so I don't know if this is true anymore, and this applies only to Zoom, but there's a hide self feature. So basically, just as I'm presenting to you, and I don't know what I'm looking like right now, you can hide your self view. I talk to my colleagues, this makes them more anxious. use with your own discretion. This is also a note that it's actually quite environmentally friendly in order to keep your camera off if you don't need it, but just more evidence for why cameras off can be good for us and the planet. Okay, and what's on this slide? The other thing is that the Zoom environment or the Blackboard environment or whatever platform you guys are using could be distracting in itself. So if you have gallery view, you have a bunch of people moving, we might be curious about what others' apartments or homes look like. Notifications like this thing, the chat coming up over and over again is super distracting to me and probably to some of you all. Notifications like this red, button call out has been designed by UX researchers over and over again to really get at, like, we want to resolve a notification as soon as it pops up. It's really there to capture our attention. So the Zoom environment, the online learning environment is very distracting. So one thing that I want to talk about is kind of using the chat space in your classroom as an opportunity to reduce distractions and kind of just using the chat as an opportunity to facilitate learning. So I love the chat as a place to kind of like get students talking to each other. But I observed this instructor that used the chat in a very organized, systematic way such that it became a learning document. So basically what the teacher did is they asked a question, right? And then the students responded with their answers, right? And then what the teacher did is they put a line across there to kind of end that part of the conversation. Then they pose another question, and then the students responded again with their answers. Then this teacher posts a line. And so this centralizes the discussion, right? First of all, it's a place where even if your camera is off and your mic is off, you can still engage in class discussion. And then what happens is if you export the chat, right, and you share it with students who maybe missed class or students who had to get up to go to the bathroom or whatever, it's very clear what happened in class and it's very clear what the discussion was about. I thought this was brilliant. It takes a little bit of like, making sure that the students are, it also can tell you whether the students are sitting in their seat, right, and engaging. But, you let students know about this ahead of time. And I praised this instructor when I was talking to them. I thought this was a wonderful way to use it and very inclusive way to get all students' voices heard. Okay, and then the last thing I wanted to talk about was restructuring our lectures to reduce mind wandering. And this actually is coming from some growing literature that's showing that pre-testing is one of these like very, very small ways that we can change our instruction to facilitate learning. And this is both pre-pandemic and during the pandemic. So, if you give a lecture, right, oftentimes we can just, like I'm doing, just talk for an hour and not get any student feedback, and maybe students get bored throughout the talk. So the first thing we want to do is pre-quiz students. So give them a very low stakes quiz, even if they haven't actually learned any of the material we're going to present, to kind of get them thinking about it, get the gears turning, get them motivated to hunt for the correct answers, even if they got it all wrong, right? Which is why low stakes is key. And then you give them a brief lecture. I think the research is saying like no more than like 12 to 15 minutes of lecture. So chunk your lectures, keep them very short to make sure students are engaged. And then another quiz, right? Low stakes again. What my work, and I can talk about this work later, and others are showing is that this is where you should encourage collaborative deliberation. So give students like a few questions to answer based on what they just reviewed. Let them collaborate with others. They'll stay motivated and engaged. And then you repeat this as needed. Do another mini lecture, do another mini quiz, mini lecture, mini quiz, so far. Keep students engaged in the class in this way. Even if they don't know the answers to the quiz in the moment, they might get it, clarification later. And then an exit paper, in different institutions call it different things, like minute paper, but this is an opportunity for you to assess what students do and do not know. It could be the same quiz all over again, right? Or it could be something new where you ask them, like, what's the main thing you learned? What do you still have questions about? But something where you get an individual assessment of students' learning. So we have collaborative, right, group answers, but what do individual students know or don't know? So anyways, there's a lot of work to show that this pre-quizzing and the interpolated quizzing is really important to produce to maintain motivation, engagement, and facilitate learning. I'm going to go through this really quickly because I want to make sure I finish within an hour. But there's student recommended stuff. This is stuff that, like, I'm sure you guys are hearing the same thing based on what my colleagues are saying, what students I know are saying, Northwestern, UChicago, University of California. I just kind of summed it up into three big things. So the first is breaks, in person and online. Breaks during discussion to just let people recharge, check their phone, whatever they need to do to maintain attention. Breaks for deep thinking too. So again, if you want them to really, really reflect, let them all turn their cameras off and then write what they need to write, or let them all turn their cameras off and just think, or just something where you can reduce the distractions that your online modality or even in-person modality might provide, and reflect and think critically, then have them come back on camera. And one thing we need to think about is a record of class. Like, students really, really, really appreciated recording class, right? Maintaining records of discussion and lecture. How do we facilitate this? How do we keep this going in person too, or in hybrid options as well? And this is a question of accessibility too for students, right? Having records of class is something that I think students have been asking for a while, at least through the disability centers that I've been working through, and it's something that they want to keep up as well. This is, again, all student recommended stuff. So lastly, I'm just going to talk about attentional capture interventions with regards to emotion regulation. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We basically gave students, right before their learning, we gave them instructions on mindfulness, and we also gave them instructions on positive reappraisal. These were 3-minute videos that me and my team created. It kind of explains the science of anxiety, which is what I did at the beginning, thinking about working memory, and the science behind each of these strategies. Very Headspace-y, if you guys are familiar with the app. And then they had 2 minutes to kind of try the interventions and then practice them. I'm not going to talk about these in detail. Positive reappraisal is reframing our stress. So instead of thinking about stress is always bad, in fact, stress is neutral. There's good stress and there's bad stress, and really it's a matter of how we think about it, but also a matter of the stress itself, the severity of the stress itself. And then mindfulness, right? So mindfulness is non-judgmental, kind of like letting go of our thoughts and worries, allowing them to arise, but not engaging with them. So they got instructions on both of these strategies. I just want to say that only mindfulness reduced the amount of mind wandering that students experienced during the study. I have many, many, many thoughts for why mindfulness worked and reappraisal didn't, and I'm sure as I described them earlier, you probably had some of the same intuitions. It's just this positive reappraisal has gotten a lot of attention in the research. So we were very surprised to see this, but mindfulness works. Like, mindfulness is something that students are really good at, just letting go of things that stress them out. But this didn't translate into differences in learning from that neuroscience lesson. And I think that one of the key things here is motivation. Did they actually care to learn, right? If we freed up their working memory resources by giving them mindfulness training, did that necessarily make them want to devote those working memory resources to thinking about neuroscience of songbirds? I don't think so. And that's kind of evidenced by this here. One thing to think about is that more students actually complied with mindfulness than they did reappraisal. So mindfulness, what this data suggests is mindfulness is easier for them to do. They're more likely to do it. It's so much easier to say, I'm dealing with very pressing pandemic-related worries. So instead of trying to reappraise how I feel about them, let me just set them aside for now. They are not relevant to the next 15 minutes of this neuroscience lesson. And I think mindfulness actually is getting a lot more empirical support for that reason. Okay, like I said, you need motivation to learn. So not only are we going to change our instructional design such that it's easier for students to learn, but we also need to make sure that we are giving them content that they want to learn, right? And that's not just like, I'm not teaching them chem anymore because they don't care about chem, but in thinking about inclusive teaching and thinking about engaging students, how do you present the material in a way that's motivating? That's something that we can all do regardless of our discipline. And students appreciate the resources. So even if reappraisal didn't work, they really, really appreciated a reminder like, hey, stress, we all get it. We're all feeling that. Try this. It can't hurt to try. Okay, in the next 2 minutes, I'm going to just kind of wrap up with some takeaways. The first is that anxiety among college students, college-age students, even students in community colleges that are not the traditional 18 to 22 age, it's been called a surge on top of a surge. We know anxiety is increasing, and then we have this external, source of anxiety, this pandemic that's kind of, it has shown to exponentially increase anxiety. There's long-term challenges too, as we discussed, and we're thinking about going back to the new normal, which is in fact not the new normal at all, but how is this compounding anxiety going to influence students' learning? The other thing is students are quite aware of the impact of distractions on their learning. It's not like their hands are up in the air like, what do I do? They know that they're in kind of noisy situations. They know that they're in non-ideal learning settings, that being away from campus or maybe being in campus now but masked, something my students are telling me, is quite distracting and quite challenging. Another thing is just being in the classroom, knowing that the virus is not gone, right? That's a threat that they still keep thinking about, and that is taking away cognitive resources they need to learn. So like trying to end on a positive note, right? Like what can we actually do? The first is always seeking student input from the beginning. I remember teaching my first class during the pandemic, and my students were like, please just listen to us. Like we've been doing pandemic learning more than you've been doing pandemic teaching, and so they just really, really wanted an opportunity for their voices to be heard. And that recommendations list I had was all student provided information that actually worked for them, right? That they do want to learn, they do want to succeed, and they really want to communicate that. The other thing is just reminding students they're not alone, they're not struggling alone, to seek community. Like we're like 18 months into the pandemic, and still like people are surprised to hear that like they're going through a lot of the same challenges. And our data show that like half of the population like is eligible for treatment based on the screening device we use. So just reminding students that they're not alone, that they should seek community whenever possible. And then another thing is to just kind of triage students' anxiety. So we didn't talk about this much with the emotion regulation side, and I'm not a mental health practitioner by any means, but to kind of suss out like if students could use a mindfulness resource, or if students could use just talking to others, or if students could use maybe reframing resources. I am much more in the camp of just changing our pedagogy. That's definitely something that we are all qualified to do, and linking to resources could mean sending them to on-campus counseling support services, or whomever, to make sure that they are emotionally supported and equipped in order to engage in learning. That's an important precondition in order to make sure that they can do well in school. And then the last thing is universal design for learning. That's really what I've been arguing for this entire talk, right? So we need to make our learning environments as distraction tolerant as possible. We need to think about the ways that we can set up our learning such that it's easier for students to clearly understand what we want them to learn. We need to be clear with our learning objectives. We need to structure environments in a way where they can get learning, where they can do higher order thinking and reasoning, comparison, and they're not just so bogged down with trying to figure out what is going on the board and stuff like that. This is an important, universal design for learning. This is something that we can use the pandemic, we can learn from this, and then we can actually try and improve our pedagogy for all students, right, in the future too. And my hope is that we don't have that selective amnesia, that we all learned what was really, really good about the pandemic, about remote learning for students, and that we apply that when we all go to completely in person in the future, and hopefully sooner rather than later. It's safe enough to do so. So that's it. I want to say thank you to you guys for listening. I went 5 minutes over, I'm sorry. But thank you for the collaborators that I had that did this research with me, my funders, and then also the participants who donated their time in the middle of the pandemic to answer these questions, and I'm forever grateful for them. So thank you, and I look forward to learning with you guys.
All right, Almaz, thank you so much. I am going to now make the chat open, or somebody I think already did, but let me just double check and stuff. Does anybody, and you please, everybody, you can, talk on your speakers if you want to. Anybody have any questions? So people are chatting, so I don't even understand, but we're good. Okay. Okay. So I thought it was wonderful. I feel Angela's jumping on. Um, does anyone have any questions about her studies and everything? Anything that sparked anybody's thought?
I'd also love to learn from you all too, hear your experiences. I don't know of any campuses. This is the only campus I know that's actually doing hybrid. That, well, that I've spoken to colleagues at there. So I would really be interested to know how this may or may not apply to what you guys are doing this quarter or this semester.
Yeah, go ahead, Francis.
All right. A couple things. I think that our students, on top of the COVID anxiety, have a lot of financial anxiety that other colleges wouldn't have. Many of them are having to work to support their parents. I appreciated your information about, I'll turn my video on, about how difficult it is to think when you have all this anxiety. My own personal experience is my sister died a month before I went to college, and my dad was very, very sick. And I can remember not being able to add numbers and just sitting and not being able to add 5 plus 7. And so I can appreciate what that is, but how can we better help the students is more what I'm looking for, other than breaking it into smaller learning sessions.
Yeah, so that's the like a lot of this, and the reason that I ended up doing this internship with Northwestern last year was feeling stuck as a researcher and a teacher and thinking like, where does the administration come in to support students? Because there's practical challenges that students experience that I can't in my classroom absolve. So like you're saying, financial, like students had to go and work, and now they're working more than maybe they would have in a non-pandemic world. And you feel a little bit like your hands are tied as an instructor. One thing is students really appreciated, honestly, just thinking about how we do assessments. So do we have to give students tests? Do we have to test students? Because that forces students to be somewhere at a certain time to take the exam. One thing you can think about is having assessments that students can do on their own time, right, to demonstrate their learning that isn't so time bound. Because in real world, as we all know, right, like how we prove ourselves or demonstrate our capacity is not so time bound. And so working around students' schedule by providing assessments that do not require them to be here at this time to show your work in this moment is one way that we can do it. The other thing is just general empathy and supporting students and flexibility. It's hard to do that at scale, but I think that's something that students have appreciated. But you're right, Francis, the practical students have to be working more, students are more tired because they're working more, students are more burdened because they're working more. Is my goal is to reach administrators too with this work.
I want to jump in on that really quick too, is that I was thinking the other day, I have one of my classes has 25 students, and I think there were 14 of them have just come from high school. So right out of high school. So they literally were at home all year last year doing remote. And because I asked, and they were all remote. And I thought about it the other day because I'm struggling with them getting their homework in. And the emails, Mrs. Reyes, it's late. Can I get a extension? Blah, blah, blah. And I've always been the type that have been like, it depends on the scenario. But then I thought back to myself, and I'm like, I think the high schools last year really did not, there were no criterias for these students. So they're now coming into college where we have these set criterias because we're, especially I think in the courses I teach, getting them ready to go out for employment possibly. And your boss, if your boss gives you a deadline, he's not giving you an extension. He's not going to understand, and so I've always gone across that mentality is that when you go out in the real world, your boss isn't going to do this for you, so I'm not going to either. But then to sit back, and this was like a thought I had this week, and say, wait a second, these kids for a year they didn't have deadlines. They didn't have, and then to come to school and be like, oh, wait a second, you now have to be accountable, really. So that's where I'm struggling a little bit. And listening to what you were saying about their anxiety and then hearing what Francis was saying, it really does. I don't want kids to drop out of school or not want to be here, but there is that fine line, I think, or the tightrope we're walking on, right?
Yes. I mean, so at Northwestern, where I'm at right now, because the first years last year were not on campus, half the students have never set foot on campus, and they just came 3 weeks ago, and you have half the student body who's never been on campus before. And one of the things that they are all struggling with because of the pandemic is time management. As 5 minutes before class, they wake up and they're in class, and now they have to figure out the time to walk between classes, to figure out when they're going to eat, so many students have just been obscenely late to office hours or something because time management is a new concern, and it's just a new thing for them to factor in. And there's a lot of I don't even know if they're soft skills, but just skills that are non-academic with a capital A, that are so important for professional development, for performance, for establishing connections with faculty, that are unpracticed, and unfortunately with us, the quarter system, we're already in week 3 of 10, right? Even in semesters, the semester goes by so quickly. First impressions are important. It's all of this adds to you have anxiety about things, but then you also have these proximal other influences that came from just being at home for a year. Students are really having a difficult time in discussions. How do you talk to somebody? That's something that they didn't really practice that much for the last year, right? And just so it's we have not yet wrapped our minds around exactly what the pandemic is going to do in terms of academic preparedness, in terms of performance, in terms of motivation to stay in school. I don't know about Triton, a lot of students deferred their enrollment because they were like, why am I going to do school online? So there's just so many different things that we're not going to know about until we finish this year and the next year.
You're absolutely right. Well, that's the thing. And a lot of students came to Triton, right? They were like, we're not going to go to a 4-year institution or spend that kind of money because I could go to Triton, right? Get my gen eds out as we figure out what's happening.
Right.
But yeah, absolutely to your point. I mean, not that the rest of these people want to know this, but my son just took the PSAT for placement for high school. And as he walked in that door, I thought, ooh, this will be fun to see what happens, because I think last year was very much a lost year for kids.
Yeah.
And stuff. And I even see it. And it's funny you say that about even having the conversations. They don't know how to have a conversation. They don't know, when I'm like, come in, have a conversation with me. And they kind of sit there and they're looking at me, and I'm running the conversation. And I'm like, but you can talk to me too. I don't bite. So it's really interesting to see. And I really enjoyed your talk. It really, showed a lot of light.
Thank you.
So I think we're almost to our time, and if anybody doesn't have any other questions, or Kevin does, great. Kevin?
Hi, Almaz. I just wanted to say thank you very much for your presentation. It was fantastic, and it went into great depths. I recently gave a presentation on cognitive load theory, and so much of what you just talked about dovetailed perfectly with what I delivered a few weeks ago. I especially liked your visual of the statistics. And as you were talking, I was thinking about my stats courses and my stats professors who loved talking about how much they knew about it and doing all the symbols and doing it all in a second and explaining the concept and the step-by-step instructions and turning around and saying, that makes sense, right? Blah, blah, blah. That makes sense, right? Blah, 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 blah. And you're just like, and then in my head, as your visual showed, all these other worries about pandemic this, pandemic that, and all the other thoughts that were going. So your visual absolutely spoke to my experience. And I just, it was a really great way of separating, okay, look at all of this extraneous load going on. And then as you went on to then show some of the charts that you designed to help us think about, well, what are the concepts? What are the similarities between regression or ANOVA or whatever statistical, thing we're doing? that was brilliant. And so a lot of that information just went perfectly in with, or dovetailed with the workshop about scaffolding instruction for students, breaking it down into chunks. You repeated key concepts about, lecturing for small bits, assessing, pre-assessment, post-assessment. So I thought it was just very thorough and really complimentary. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I really appreciate that. It's so funny talking about assessing or just teaching in general, because something that my colleagues share a lot is if I give students a table like that where I'm telling them basically how to when I organize learning in that way, professors often come to me and they're like, "Aren't you giving away the answer?" No, we're not giving away the answer, right? The answer, if your answer is recall all the time, like if your answer is just tell me and the student tells you and it was just rote memorization, that works sometimes, but and maybe you do assess students on their recall sometimes, but oftentimes our goal is the higher order, the why, the how, the what does this mean? And so especially at a place like University of Chicago where people are like trying to say like, oh, we think about theory, we think about application, and we think about higher order. It's not giving away the answer. And there's a lot of anxiety with professors about, and faculty in general, about if you scaffold it too much, then you're helping students and students are not agents of their own learning. But, Kevin, like you're saying, that's not the case at all. This is actually a way in which you scaffold it so that they can get to a place in which they're doing the better learning. So
Right.
I've run into that so many times, and it gets so frustrating because we assume that we're teachers. We're not just giving information. We are presenting it in a way that's most conducive to learning. And I think sometimes people forget about that. So I appreciate that we're speaking the same language here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as Mary points out, we're helping students to frame the questions and to think through things. And, with your other example about history, I taught art history for 15 years. And so all it was just blah, 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 blah. But so I would create worksheets like you had, because in a lecture of 3 hours, students need to break things down into bits. And as teachers, it's sometimes hard to do that. So giving structure to students and key ideas to listen for and breaking it down into categories was a way to work with the brain to chunk that information into that category and chunk that into that category. So it's just fascinating to hear your more in-depth presentation about these ideas. And so our goal is to facilitate learning, and working with the way the cognitive structure of the brain is designed is like working for the optimal outcome of moving it into long-term memory, moving it from that short-term or that working memory into that long-term retention. So that's all really encouraging. So thank you for your extensive research there. It's great.
Thank you. I see we have a question in the chat, so I'm going to read it. Okay. So this question in the chat about recommendations for triaging anxiety. So I did mention that briefly in the takeaways. Assessing the level of anxiety students are dealing with in your class is a better way to get a better idea of how to assist students in dealing with overload anxiety within the classroom. Yeah, so per your example, perhaps surveying students on a per class basis is what I do. So again, major caveat, I have a PhD in psychology, but not at all am I a practitioner by any means. So what I do in my classes is just take the temperature of the class, right? So if students are all super feeling anxious or defeated or whatever, it's not by any means an opportunity to cancel class. We still have to engage in class even when we're all kind of going through things, but acknowledging it, being empathetic, and then also modifying maybe ways in which we were going to teach to fit the students where they're at, right? So it might be like in all my classes, I would provide an opportunity for students to kind of go into breakout rooms. This was during remote teaching, breakout rooms for the first 5 minutes of class. Again, something that they had asked for, so they could communicate, build community with each other, commiserate, to be honest, is what they did in a lot of the classes, or a lot of the breakout sessions, and just kind of like transition from whatever they were doing to online learning and commiserate with their peers, get to know them, because we're all just, you know, boxes in gallery view. And then part of the main takeaways that I also shared was that students, you know, building community and letting students know that it's like every single student that we had surveyed in our study said, I'm extremely anxious, and to some degree they had kind of conveyed to us that they felt they were the only one, which is not statistically impossible, right? Not everybody can be anxious and then only feel like they're the only one in reality. So I think providing community in that way is one way in which you could not necessarily alleviate anxiety, but alleviate the uncertainty or stress that you might feel from being the only one that's dealing with something. So that's one non-practitioner way in which I like try to account for anxiety in the classroom. But triaging students is like, if I see my class is super, super anxious, I actually would go and personally consult with like our mental health office on campus to see what I could do. Like I delegate to them and I kind of ask them what's best there. I hope that answered that question. It's like a half answer because I'm not qualified, but that's what I kind of meant in the triage. Are they good, or they maybe likely they need some more support, and we go to the appropriate resources for that. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? All right. You know, you say that and then somebody comes up with a question.
My email, I don't know if you have my email anywhere, but
Could you put it in the chat?
Yeah, I can put it in the chat.
That'd be great. Thank you.
If you have any other questions or comments, I don't know, you can just email me, and I'd be happy to talk more.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much. I can't even express how appreciative we are to have you come and visit us at Triton. And, you know, you can always come and do research here. We like to fill out documents, so.
I appreciate it. That's every researcher's dream.
Right? So, all right. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Enjoy your day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you again. My audio wasn't working earlier.
Bye. Thank you.